Thank you very much. The title of my talk today is Government Intervention, Individual Freedom, and Prosperity. Now, I'm going to say some things that will perhaps, not perhaps, but will break with conventional wisdom on a lot of subjects in a very substantial way. To the extent that that is true, you may have some questions in mind, and if we have a few minutes towards the end of the talk, I'll be willing to answer questions. And when you ask the questions, you don't have to feel as though you owe me any undue courtesy because I'm your guest. Just ask any kind of question that you want and make any kind of comment that you want, and rest in comfort with the fact that I will be leaving town, and so you can go back to doing things the way you've been doing them. I think one of the first observations that we might want to make is that the Reagan presidency has raised several issues having to do with things like fairness, justice, and the legitimate role of government. These issues arise at a time when we as a nation face numerous problems that I feel threaten our future as a rich and free nation. The symptoms of our problems are manifested in the form of high interest rates, high unemployment, high deficits, and the threat of renewed inflation. Some of my colleagues who are in the area of monetary economics guess that we may very well be back with double-digit inflation by 85, 86. Now note that I refer to these as symptoms of our problem rather than causes. For right now, until I delve a little bit further into the matter, I'll summarize the cause of our problems as being a significant departure from the principles of economic freedom that made us a rich nation in the first place. These principles of economic freedom were embodied in our nation through our Constitution. Let me spend a few minutes talking about what economic freedom is, or free enterprise, or capitalism. I use all these terms interchangeably. In the economic sphere, our founding fathers thought that relatively free markets, or what is called capitalism, was the most effective social organization for the promotion of individual freedom. Indeed, capitalism is defined as a system wherein individuals are free to pursue their own interests. That is, there is voluntary exchange. There are private property rights held in goods and services in a free enterprise system. Much of the original intent of the United States Constitution was to bring about a climate in which this kind of social organization could occur. The free enterprise system rests on the right of individuals to own and control resources that are their own. The free enterprise system, through the important linkage of ownership and control, minimizes the capacity of one person to coerce another. Furthermore, with extensive private property rights, or private ownership and control over productive resources, the coercive powers of the state are minimized. I might add at this juncture that taxes represent claims on private property. That is, high taxes, in effect, confiscate private property. That is, if there's 100% tax on your wages, it's as if you did not own your own personal services. If there's a 50% tax, well, then you're just kind of a half a slave. Now, under free enterprise or capitalism, the powers of the state are restricted to the role of enforcing constitutional order and providing certain public goods such as national defense, public health, and perhaps, and I stress perhaps, highway construction. Now, the primary benefit of the free enterprise system is that it induces people to act in ways that are consistent with what might be called the social good with minimal coercion. That is, competition directly identifies the highest valued alternative uses for society's scarce resources. Self-interest, along with the right to transfer, namely buy and sell, ensures that these scarce resources will indeed be put to their highest valued alternative uses. Now, for the past several decades, free enterprise has been under unrelenting attack. Americans from all walks of life, and I stress all walks of life, have demonstrated a deep and abiding contempt for private property rights and individual freedom. Free enterprise, or capitalism, is threatened today not because of its failure, but because of its success. That is, due to the obvious success of capitalism in America, we have become increasingly unwilling to accept or tolerate various problems that man faces. And the success of capitalism that we take for granted too often is in the area of eliminating disease, pestilence, hunger, and gross poverty. That is, those problems that have plagued mankind throughout most of its existence on earth. We have won the war against those kind of problems in America. The desire by many Americans to eliminate these, quote, unbearable, close quote, and, quote, inexcusable problems has led us away from those basic ideals and principles upon which our prosperous nation has been built, in the name of other ideals, such as equality of income, orderly markets, consumer protection, energy conservation, just to name a few. We have abandoned many personal freedoms. As a result of widespread control by government in an effort to achieve these so-called higher objectives, men have been subordinated to the point where considerations of personal freedom are but secondary or tertiary matters. We have, to demonstrate this, we have a whole lot of programs that we just call entitlement programs. Now, in my reading of the Constitution of the United States, nowhere in that Constitution says that one American is entitled to those things that belong to me. But today, we accept that as a given because we say that government should do good. Government should provide people with food. Government should provide people with decent housing. But you see the immorality of that if you ask the question, does government have any resources of its own? That is, when we have a CETA program or urban renewal program or a food stamp program, are those congressmen and senators in Washington spending their own money for those programs? They're not. That is, the only way that government can give one American $1 is to first confiscate that $1 from another American under intimidation, threat, and coercion, and ultimately violence. And if you think that my words are too strong as to how government gets its dollars, You try telling the IRS that you don't feel like paying and see what they do. Now, so we've lost sight of an important moral question in America, namely, that is, if one person benefits from something, who should pay? Namely, if I benefit from this tie, who should pay for it? If I benefit from a hamburger, who should pay for it? I believe I should pay for it, or I should not benefit. Now, interventionists and do-gooders don't ask these kind of questions because there's no moral answer to these questions in terms of what the do-gooders would like to see. Now, the ultimate end to this process that we're engaging in America is totalitarianism, which is not much more than a reduced form of servitude. Alice de Tocqueville captured the essentials of what I'm saying in this respect in the following quote in reference to injustice. And I quote him. He says that democracy extends the sphere of individual freedom. Socialism restricts it. Democracy attaches all possible value to each man. Socialism makes each man a mere agent, a mere number. Democracy and socialism, de Tocqueville goes on, have nothing in common but one word, and that is equality. But notice the difference, says de Tocqueville. While democracy seeks equality in liberty, socialism seeks equality in restraint and servitude. And if you look at the debate going on during the Reagan years, we're indeed talking about, or we're debating about, equality in restraint and servitude. As I said earlier, free enterprise has several laudatory characteristics. Let me just comment on some more of them. Under free enterprise and voluntary exchange, there is no rape. There's only seduction. Now, that might be strange terminology coming from an economist. Now, but before I explain it, let me tell you that I am for seduction and against rape. Now, seduction is the kind of exchange, for example, where I proposition you and I say, you make me feel good and I'll make you feel good. In fact, that's what I do when I go to a grocer to buy a pound of butter. I tell the grocer, if you make me feel good, give me that pound of butter. I'll make you feel good. I'll give you this $2. Now, under seduction, both parties benefit from the exchange. Now, rape, on the other hand, is something like this. If I go to the grocer and I say, unless you make me feel good, I'm going to make you feel bad. And that's like when I went to him, if I go to him and say, unless you give me that pound of butter, I'm going to blow your brains out. Now, widespread private control and ownership of property is consistent with seduction and the minimization of rape. Widespread government ownership and or control over property is consistent with rape maximization. In fact, government in our country is a major source of rape-like exchanges or coercive exchanges. For example, the draft. Back in 1959, I got a letter, and it said, Williams, will you stop making $500 a month and begin to make $99 a month? Normally, to get a person to accept that proposition, you have to use some kind of coercion. Or alternatively, you get notes from the government, pay your taxes or you'll go to jail. Or you'll get notes from the government, pay taxes to support Amtrak whether you ride it or not, or whether you like it or not, or go to jail. And we can think of many, many more examples of these kind of exchanges we make. Now, we have to recognize, by contrast, look at the free market, or the relatively free market. Despite all the rhetoric made about the bigness of Exxon, or the bigness of Chrysler and their supposed power, the only way that Chrysler will get $1 from me is if I voluntarily give that $1 to Chrysler. That does not explain my relationship with government. That is, government can get $1 from you or me, even if you don't volunteer to give it. Of course, Chrysler can get $1 from me coercively if it first goes to Washington and gets Congress to order the IRS to get the dollar and then give it to them. Now, these characteristics of voluntary exchange and the minimization of coercion, the characteristics of the free market, these characteristics of the free market are roundly denounced by the most ardent defenders of what has come to be called human rights. Modern defenders of human rights are the chief supporters of reduced private property rights and reduced rights to profits, and they are anti-competition and pro-monopoly and pro-control by the state. The great drive for collectivization of ownership and government control in our country predictably comes from society's elite. It comes from legislators, government officials, academics, and other elite. And these people gain substantial rewards through collectivization because it puts more resources in their control. It means that they have higher rewards and lower accountability standards. In their arrogance, they wish to eliminate the market and what is implied by the market, that is, voluntary exchange. That is, most totalitarians and tyrants of the world, their first order of business is to eliminate the free market because they don't feel that people acting voluntarily will do what the tyrant or totalitarian thinks that they should do. So they would like to eliminate the free market. These people, they advocate economic planning. And economic planning is nothing more than the forcible superseding of other people's plans by the powerful elite. Of course, they do this all in the name of good. Do-gooders fail to realize that most good is done in the name of greed as opposed to the name of good. Adam Smith, the father of economics, recognized this in his monumental work, Inquiry into the Causes, Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. He says that man has almost constant occasion for the help of his brethren, and it is in vain for him to expect it from their benevolence only. Smith continues, he says, he will be more likely to prevail if he can interest their self-love in his favor and show them that it is for their own advantage to do for him what he requires of them. And that's what Adam Smith means. He means quid pro quo. That is, you cater to a man's self-interest to get what you want. And some people call that self-interest greed. That is, if I had to name, if any one of you were to ask me to name the motivation that delivered the most good in this world, I would indeed say greed. In other words, for example, the citizens of New York derive their daily meals, they get steaks in New York, not because the Texas rancher loves the people in New York. Matter of fact, he may hate the people in New York, but nonetheless, he makes sure that steak is on the shelves every day in New York. Many people have asked me questions with regard to future generations, and I've responded in kind, again, talking about the benefit of greed. I responded in kind, well, I don't care anything about the future generations. People say, well, Williams, I don't understand you. And so I said, well, why should I care about the future generations? What have they ever done for me? That is, what has some kid that's going to be born in 2050 or 2020, what has he ever done for me? Nothing. So why should I do anything for him? But however, this attitude does not reflect my behavior, because if you came to my house in Devon, Pennsylvania, you would see that several years ago, instead of taking $300 to buy a suit or to go on a mini weekend vacation or to go to a fine French restaurant, instead of doing that, I bought some seedlings, some 2- and 3-year-old seedlings. Now those trees, they will mature long after I'm dead. That is, there'll be some future generation benefiting from those trees. Now, why did I do it? It's because I love myself. That is, I make repairs on my house, I plant trees, and et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because it raises the market value of my house. I get more for my house when I sell it. Now, by pursuing my own selfish interests, I ensure that there's a house, a nice house, available for a future generation. Now, the question is, would I have those same incentives if the government owned my house? Would I have the same incentives if there was a 75% tax on the house when I sell it? No, I wouldn't. So I'm arguing that it is human greed or the pursuit of wealth that is in the best social interest. Many of you, just to kind of pursue this matter a little more, to convince you of the laudatory characteristics of the free market, many of you are sensitive individuals concerned with conservation issues. You may be worried about the extinction of the whale, the buffalo, the bald eagle, and the redwoods. You know, every once in a while I see kids on television, playing, saying, don't be foolish or try to save the bald eagle. And I wonder about this personally because I was 37 years old before I saw a bald eagle, and I did fairly well prior to seeing a bald eagle. But beyond that, I always ask the question, well, how come everybody's worried about whales, elephants, and bald eagles? How come nobody's worried about chickens becoming extinct? There's no pig movement, or cows, or sheep becoming extinct. Well, what's the difference between those animals that we worry about becoming extinct and those that we don't? One list you find that all the animals are privately owned. It is in somebody's personal private interest to make sure that they don't become extinct. Now, on the other list of the animals that we worry about are those who belong to the people. And it is in nobody's personal private interest to make sure that the animal does not become extinct. There are other examples, say, of private ownership versus public ownership. Disneyland is sure cleaner than Sequoia National Park. Why? Is it because the Disneyland owners are just nice people? No, it's because they will lose money if fewer people come to the park. But the people who work for the Department of Interior, their pay will go on whether people like the park or not. So you'll get a different set of incentives. Okay, so I'm arguing that private property rights performs at least two important social functions. It encourages people to do voluntarily what's in the social interest. It minimizes the coercive power that one man or the state can have over another. Anything that weakens private property interferes with the attainment of these two socially desirable functions. That's why things like government taxation and regulation is such a threat. Taxation and regulation can be viewed as confiscation of some or all of the freedom to use property. Now, before I go on to taxing and regulations, I might give you an example, because you might be wondering, well, Williams, what are the legitimate functions of government? What should government be doing? Well, I think that there's a very good test for legitimate government activities. That is, you only need to ask yourself the question, does government do what I would get arrested for if I did it? And if that turns out to be the case, if you say that, well, if I did it, I would become arrested, but government does it, well, then that's illegitimate government function. We can think of many cases like this. Government can engage in activities where you as businessmen would be sued for antitrust violations. That is, government can set up price-fixing boards, market divisions, et cetera, but you would get prosecuted for antitrust violation. Or let me give you another example. There could be some poor old lady downtown who needs some teeth or needs some food. Well, if I came up to you with a pistol and I said, give me $200 or I'll shoot you, and then having gotten the $200, I take it to the old lady and give her the money for some food, what would you arrest me? Would you arrest me? Would you find me guilty of a crime? Of course you would. But that act does not differ conceptually from when the IRS comes up to me and says, Williams, you know that $200 you made last week you had planned to put away for your daughter's education? You will not do that. You will give us the money and we'll give it to the lady downtown who needs teeth. They both represent theft, but one is legal and one is illegal. The government theft is legal. So, again, the test of illegitimate government activity is to ask yourself, would you get arrested if you did the same thing? Government taxing and regulation do not only constitute the major threat to private enterprise and economic freedom. Inflation is a major threat. And inflation is indeed a result of government activity, of spending and creating money. Now, many Americans consider the effects of inflation neutral if a person is unfairly punished by having his retirement income reduced by inflation, but this is offset by his ill-gotten gain because his house is worth more money. Or many Americans look at inflation as only rising prices. Well, I assert that if you view inflation this way, you trivialize the effects of inflation. Inflation is socially devastating for several reasons, and as I'm explaining these reasons, you can think about your own personal cases. One reason why inflation is devastating to social order is because the courts of the United States do not view inflation as a source of illegitimate outcomes. Let me give you an example of this. Suppose I bought a U.S. savings bond in 1950 for $15, and the government said they would give me $25 in 1975 when it matures. Now, 1975 comes, and the government gives me $25, but I can't buy with the $25 what I could have bought with the principal alone in 1950. So I go to court, and I tell the court that the government has not lived up to my legitimate expectations about this bond. And so the court says to me, well, Williams, did the government pay you $25 as is promised? I say, yeah, but they say, case closed. The government has lived up to its legitimate expectations. Now, I know the government has not lived up to its expectations, and I suffer a loss. Now, who are the bondholders in our country? From an economic point of view, net monetary creditors are bondholders. That is, those who have more money owed them than they owe out. They're bondholders. People who are bondholders are people on retirement checks, Social Security checks, et cetera, et cetera. These people face huge losses as a result of inflation. Now, these people are not going to take these losses lying down. That is, these people are going to form political compacts. And if they're strong enough politically, say like retired people, they're going to approach Congress and say, look, Congress, the government messed me up on my Social Security. We want you to give me a handout. We want Meals on Wheels. We want COLAs. We want this and we want that. And if the group is strong enough, Congress will concede to their demands. But however, in order for Congress to give them a privilege or to help them, it must hurt somebody else by raising their taxes. And if that group is politically strong enough and it descends on Congress, Congress will try to help them, which in turn hurts some other group, and we become more politically organized in our country, and hence we increase the potential for conflict. That is, we tend to move away from rule of law towards rule by men, and I believe that that is devastating. And when we move away from rule by law, it shifts the society from a social justice concept of equality under the law, which I think is the correct concept for social justice, towards income equality, which I think is the wrong concept of social justice. Now, inflation does some other things. That is, one important function of the law in an orderly and just society is that the legal system must ensure the reliability of contracts. Inflation makes the law impotent in achieving that end. Partly because of this, people will invest more resources in the prevention of being ripped off by inflation. Such a reallocation by people of resources by people to prevent them from being ripped off by inflation will cause us to produce fewer goods and be poorer as a result. Let me give you an example of the latter. An example of this is the way businesses operate today, or they have operated in the past. The product designer who will come up with a marginally improved product is worth less to a company. The production manager who in a good year is capable of increasing the product per man is worth less to the company. The vice president of sales who might reduce the real cost of redistribution is worth less to the company. The important person to the company under the regime of inflation is the manager of finance who can adjust the books of the company to minimize the impact of unpredictable inflation, not to mention predictable taxes. Or maybe a more important person of the company will be the guy who can do a good job at guessing what the Federal Reserve Bank will do. Now, of course, when you buy shoes or cars, you're paying for these services, which are of no value to us personally. You're paying for the services of people I call inflation pimps. They live off of inflation. Despite the virtues of the free market, there's considerable hostility towards it, as I mentioned earlier. Social reformers assert that the free market doesn't work, that it's dehumanizing. This is incredible. And businessmen, when they're attacked on free markets being inhuman, they don't know how to defend themselves. I think one thing that you want to say to these attackers, and it is evidenced by history, that with the rise of capitalism has been associated with the better treatment of women, of insane persons, and of criminals. Capitalism has introduced humanity among men. Furthermore, with the rise of capitalism, people began to be rich, or a way to get rich was to serve your fellow man. That is, with the rise of capitalism, ships in the 14th, 15th, 16th century stop bringing back precious gems and silks for the elite, they started bringing back all kinds of material for the common man. In fact, capitalism, despite its critics, is very pro the common man. The common man is the winner in capitalism. And you just need to ask yourself, well, who became the richest person? Was it Ford or was it Rolls-Royce? That is, Rolls-Royce was making cars for the elite. Ford was making cars for the common man. Or who becomes richer? The music companies that produce records of Beethoven, Bach, and Liszt? Or those companies that produce acid rock and all the music for the common man? It's obviously the latter. This is, I believe, one of the reasons why the elite find the free market unacceptable, because it is indeed it's pro the common man. And maybe another example you can think of when you go home tonight is to look at television and you ask yourself, who does commercial television cater to with the Archie Bunker and Alice shows and all this kind of stuff? They cater to the common man. Now, when the elite want their television, what do? They rip off the common man through the taxes that go to public broadcasting to get their Leonard Bernstein and their Sesame Street shows, et cetera, et cetera. This is a chief reason why the elite are against free markets, because indeed it is pro the common man. Now, let me begin to conclude here. Most government intervention in our country has to do with denying privileges to some Americans and granting them to others. In fact, I might say, H.L. Mencken gave a good definition of an election. H.L. Mencken said, an election is an advance auction on the sale of stolen goods. And indeed, this is what politicians do. That is, they work their way into office by promising one American that he will use his office to take that which belongs to another American and give it to the voter. Now, don't blame the politician. We are to blame for this, because that's how he gets our votes, by promising to use his office towards that end. Now, this kind of privilege granting is an activity by government that dates back beyond the Dark Ages, where the guilds and the mercantile associations controlled trade in their particular areas. With a payment to the king, we call them political contributions today, or the reigning lord, they were granted monopoly privileges. These monopoly privileges gave them the right to live at the expense of other persons. And this is what we have. For example, I'm sure that, I don't know that much about Cleveland, but I'm sure that the taxi cab has a monopoly in your city, or they have monopoly privileges. And what that says, you're telling one American he may drive a taxi cab, he may own and operate a taxi cab for a living, and you're telling another American in Cleveland he may not. And I would imagine that the taxi cab lobby contributes to the political campaigns. Now, every group in America, almost every group in America, has come to feel, quote unquote, the government owes them a special privilege or favor. Manufacturers feel that the government owes them protective tariffs. Farmers feel that the government owes them crop subsidies. Organized labor feels that the government should keep their jobs protected from competition with those who are not union members. Coastal areas think that the government should give them funds for rivers and harbors. Intellectuals think that the government should give them funds for research. The unemployed and the unemployable feel that the government owes them a living. Big business feels that government should protect them from the rigors of open market competition. Almost every occupation, profession, or trade feels that the government, through licensing and other forms of regulations, should protect their incomes from competition that would be caused by others entering the trade. These and many other privileges granted by government leads to disadvantages that are being borne by other people not granted the privilege. So that means that government must give them a privilege or favor to offset the disadvantage created by government granting some other group a privilege. Sounds very complicated. Indeed, it is complicated. Matter of fact, there's a Negro play called Green Pastures, and somewhere in the play, God says to the angel Gabriel, and this passage in the play accurately, insightfully describes the dilemma of government. Well, God says to the angel Gabriel, every time I passes one miracle, I has to pass 4 or 5 more to catch up with it. That is the dilemma of government. That is, government creates a miracle for one person, which of necessity creates a non-miracle for somebody else. And if that person has power, he comes to government to get a miracle created for him, and the process goes on and on. Government intervention and privilege granting creates disadvantages for many people in our country. These disadvantages manifest themselves in many forms. High rates of youth unemployment, high and increasing rates of minority youth unemployment, poverty of the elderly who have had their retirement funds destroyed by inflation, the increasing decline of our cities, economic stagnation, high interest rates, et cetera, et cetera. The sight of these problems to government officials and many legislators is usually interpreted by them as the original plan was poorly designed, and what is needed is a stronger and more comprehensive plan placing greater government control over resources and individual decisions. But I think our solution is quite the opposite. That is, to get government out of our lives. I find it incredible when I speak to many city administrators and some of the officials at HUD when they talk about urban renewal and things like this. I find it quite incredible when they say we need a housing program, we need a planning program. And I ask them, I say, well, you know, when New York, a city that is a monument to man's genius, was being built, late 1800s, turn of the century, where was HUD? I mean, I asked them, how could it have been done without HUD? Or people talk about the poor in our country. And if there's a unique characteristic of our country, it's that we are a nation of poor people, we're a nation of minorities, that is our ancestors. And I ask people, well, you know, when the poor Irish came in our country in 1848, fleeing famine in Ireland, how did they make it without a food stamp program? I mean, there was none available. What they had is what poor people don't have today. They had free enterprise and minimal government. Now, I've said all this, and so you say, well, Williams, well, what's the real solution? Well, I have a solution. I'm going to wind up with the solution. And I propose this in Congress. Matter of fact, there's one crazy congressman who has introduced my solution on the floor of the House. I call him crazy because he risks his political life. And I propose, and I've done it several times in Congress, I propose that we have a constitutional amendment that would read something like this: that no state nor any individual should be permitted to interfere in any manner with voluntary exchange between 2 or more individuals. Now, a lot of people will find that bothersome because they'll say, well, some people might do some voluntary things that I don't like. Well, I urge you to consider the following: that the true test of one's commitment to free speech does not come when you allow people to be free to say those things that you think they should say or those things that you agree with. The true test of your commitment to individuals, to freedom of speech, comes when you permit people to say those things that you find offensive. Similarly with human action, The true test of one's commitment to individual freedom does not come when we allow people to be free to do those things that we think that they should do. The true test comes when we allow people to do those things that we may find personally obnoxious. And finally this time, I think it is a sad twist. It's a sad commentary on what America has become. When, like I have tried today, the American who argues the case for individual freedom and protection of private property rights is viewed as the mean, insensitive, uncaring person, while the person who argues for more government, more control, less personal freedom is viewed as progressive and sensitive. Thank you very much.